Elise Milano. I'm a former CoinDesk reporter and a current PhD student at the London School of Economics, studying social anthropology and focusing on blockchain and crypto. And so blockchain might just be software, but it has from its inception been entangled with debates about freedom and power, privacy and surveillance, and the gatekeeping of money and liquidity. But ask an economist about these technologies and they'll tell you things like Bitcoin is not money, it never will be, but that it might be good for things like reducing the cost of networking and verification. Ask a law professor and they'll probably talk to you about contract law and regulatory regimes. Or ask a central banker and they'll talk to you about balance sheet implications in monetary policy. And these conversations are important, but by the end of them, you'll probably find that you still know almost nothing about the social conditions and people that make blockchain and crypto possible and enable them to work. But arguably, for anyone truly interested in the future of this industry, these are precisely the things we need to know. This is where the humanities and social sciences come in, and this is what we're here to talk about today. And I'm joined here by Anne Brody from York University and Jason Windawi from Princeton University. And so I want to start out by asking you two to briefly introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your backgrounds, what disciplines you're coming from, maybe explain what those disciplines are for those in the audience who are not terribly familiar with them, and what you're currently researching.
Okay, so I'll go first. So I have an MA in communication studies. Can you all hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? No?
Jason, do you want to go ahead in the meantime?
Sure. Great. Is mine on? Can you hear me? Okay, cool. So Jason Windawi, I am doing a PhD in sociology at Princeton. I study new forms of social organization and governance that are enabled by blockchain. And I mean social organization very broadly because that's, in sociology, when we use the word organization, we tend to think of social structures, which can happen at multiple scales. And so that's how I study what I study. In terms of my background, I was in investment management before that. So I come with a very jaded and skeptical eye toward any claims of innovation in financial services, having seen the carnage that came before. But yeah, with that, I'll pass it over or maybe keep talking. Oh.
So just a momentary delay with the microphone.
Another thing about sociology, the reason I think sociology is a particularly interesting way to look at this is not necessarily because of any methodological reason, but primarily because the origins of our discipline come out of trying to understand the first industrial revolution and trying to understand the social changes that were happening at the time as the world went from an agrarian world to a more industrialized world. And so you can imagine that a lot of the same questions come up now. And so I think sociology is a particularly useful place to start looking at those questions.
Right, what do they say? We're in the fourth industrial revolution
exactly,
or something?
Exactly. Something like that.
Right. Okay, Anne.
Okay, y'all can hear me now. Okay, so I have an MA in Culture and Communication Studies, and I'm going off to do my PhD in Communication Studies with Gabriella Coleman. She's an anthropologist that did her study on the Debian Linux community and the anonymous hacker group. Currently my research is interested in the ideologies of blockchain communities. More specifically, I focused on Ethereum. I conducted an ethnographic research at DEF CON 4 last year in Prague, just speaking with attendants and trying to understand how people think about blockchain. I think that's very important. I guess it's sort of strange for some, but I'm really interested in the epistemological approach to blockchain. It's more philosophical, but something that I'm very interested in is ideological utopianism, and I take a very critical stance on it, and I see a lot of that in blockchain spaces, and I think we really have to tread carefully with that kind of ideology. And also, I'm interested in seeing how technological design actually influences the cultural dynamics of blockchain communities and technological communities in general. So.
Great, yeah, I think we've got some really interesting things to discuss here. And before we kind of talk more about the social sciences and humanities and what they have to offer, and also about your research findings, I want to discuss kind of the things that are already out there. And I want to ask, for anthropologists at least, economists are sort of our favorite battering ram. We don't really love them. And so I want to know what you guys think about kind of the limitations of the existing research that's been done by academics, like economists, like legal scholars, like cryptographers, these sorts of people, and kind of what they can't tell us about things like ideology or governance or money or markets or networks or organizations. And Jason, I want to start with you because not only do you have this private sector background, but I understand that you also have a master's in quantitative methods. So you've seen sort of both sides of the coin here.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think that to your first question about the disciplines, I think there's a real, look, we're all trained very thoroughly in one discipline, and that's how a PhD works. The problem is the streetlight problem, right? Like if you're looking under a streetlight, you're going to find the keys under that streetlight. And so things will look a certain way, and you'll shoehorn them. There's a threat of sort of putting them into a model that might look okay, but might not make much sense. So for example, if we're going to pick on economists, I think that Williamson drives me crazy. But so Oliver Williamson had a very successful and extremely influential body of theory about transaction costs and minimizing transaction costs, and really his whole thesis was that you will pick the structure of governance that minimizes your transaction costs, which is fair enough. But the problem with that is that, and the problem I think is always the people who come after the innovator. So the people who've come after Williamson have assumed that governance just means structure. But governance is actually a process. It's decision making. It's, to take a word from the technology, it's consensus building, right? And so thinking about those processes doesn't necessarily fit into a Williamson, governance as a structure framework. I would also say that there's a bigger divide. So it's normal to talk about a quantitative versus qualitative divide, and I think the more important divide is between people who want to model everything and make a model versus people who empirically want to go in, and whether they're using ethnography or statistics, or I use a lot of language processing and topic modeling, making sense of something empirically, where you have a little bit of theory, but you're not trying to build a perfect from first principles model. And I think that's also been a limitation on the work. And then I'd say one thing which I really don't like about when people who study organizations go into the field and start, so these would be my sort of peers in business schools and sociology departments, is there's a real danger of not doing the work and really understanding what the technology is. And when you don't do the work, you end up doing things like adopting terms like trustless or DAO without really thinking about what they mean. And so there are a couple of organizational scholars who call every blockchain project a DAO, which kind of doesn't make any sense if you know what a DAO is. And yet, if you hear this language and you're not making the familiar strange, you're just sort of accepting what they're telling you, there's a real danger of that.
Right, and I think to your point about models, I think that in some of these disciplines, when you start talking about models, there's such a push to kind of get this pure model that has to kind of function perfectly. It has to make sense and be coherent and cogent. And I think the problem with that is you start taking like the aggregate of data and you miss the outliers, and the outliers are important. And when you sort of shove things into these frameworks, it just looks too homogeneous, and you sort of miss the important things that don't quite fit, and those are the sort of things that caused the financial crisis.
Partially, but oh yeah, sure, we can talk about that.
It's a big one. Sorry, we can not talk about that.
But to your point about leaving things out, I went to a fintech conference a couple of months ago up in Toronto, and there was paper after paper after paper on Bitcoin as an investment, where they were modeling it using price data and looking solely at price dynamics in the context of how you might model a stock or a commodity, which completely ignored the many other uses and other reasons why Bitcoin might be going up and down. So for example, they didn't include things like hash rate, or it was just strictly a financial model done by people trained to look under that streetlight. And so it was very neat modeling, and the models were well validated, and there were reasons why they picked them, but they weren't really capturing the phenomenon.
Right. So, Anne, given your research experience, what have you found? I mean, how kind of can these approaches just fail to capture the things that you've seen in your research?
So I don't necessarily think that all those perspectives, the non-qualitative, are limited. I think they all have their own value and strength. And it's important not to fall into binary thinking, but what the social sciences can do is that they could provide the frameworks that are necessary for seeing out the larger scope of things and for contextualizing that hard data. One strength of the social sciences is that it could show you how everything is interconnected to help you think about the blind spots, so that we can navigate into the future more responsibly and have more accountability when it comes to like innovative technologies like blockchain.
Right, right. I think, one thing that social science is so great at is that, we start thinking about things as relationships oftentimes.
Exactly.
And, when you look at money as sort of like a neutral medium of exchange or a commodity or all these sorts of things, you kind of miss the important things that are happening. When you shove them into these kind of narrow frameworks, you miss the relationships that they're creating and the relationships that came out of. And arguably, that's really important to understand when you're trying to build new networks and these sorts of things. And so I want to move on a little bit and talk about kind of the particular aspects of the blockchain industry and cryptocurrency that you guys think might benefit the most from research by social sciences scholars and humanities scholars. Jason, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Seems like you have some thoughts.
No, that's a hard one because when you're, there's an investment industry cliche of talking your book, right? So it's hard when you're in the middle of a dissertation not to just talk about what you are working on as though that's the thing. Right. But so what I'm finding is that I spend a lot of time thinking about what organization is and what governance means and how these are held together. And that's not something, that you can do with one research methodology for various reasons that I can talk about later, but it's also not something that would immediately be evident in any one discipline, so I would put it that way. I would say that sociology, I benefit from being, what's that Kuhnian term? It's a weak paradigm, right? There's no like one method, one approach to modeling things, and so it's a very diverse, uncentered discipline, so it's very easy for me to reach into law or reach into economics or reach into, a little harder to reach into computer science, but if you're willing to do some of the work, then people will meet you partway and help you. But yeah, so I would say that. Yeah,
I think you're completely right, and I think it's probably important that in this discussion we don't kind of set it up. I think I've kind of set this up as a bit of a binary of sort of social sciences on the one side and these other disciplines on the other, but their interdisciplinary work is really important, and that can kind of produce fantastic results.
Yeah, I think it's the only way in a lot of ways to do this kind of thing, especially for, I think a lot of the challenge with studying something like blockchains and crypto is that it's new and it's happening now, right? So all the methods we learn are about, at least in sociology, we're trained more in quantitative than we are in qualitative, which I think is a shame. But it's much more common to study things in retrospect when you know they're real, right? When you know they've happened. And so I'd be interested in both of your perspectives on that, coming from where you come from, because it can be very hard to communicate with people that you're studying something that's an actual phenomenon.
Yeah, and then it's kind of in flux and still, it's very much still kind of becoming. Yeah. And what do you think about that? And what do you think also, to return to the question about kind of the specific areas of blockchain and crypto that could benefit from this type of research?
Something that I've noticed from my own research is that there is this whole move fast, break things ideology. That pertains to startup culture, and I think that's something that we have to be really careful with, because while these technologies are trying to solve problems, they're simultaneously just going off and creating more problems that are going to cause disasters in the long run. I think we've seen that with the internet. Originally the vision was that it's supposed to be democratizing technology. Now it's just in the hands of a few big players, and I certainly don't think that would be good for blockchain. So I think social science can help us, again, navigate, help us take a more ethical trajectory, learn from the past, especially using historical frameworks, as to not repeat the same mistakes.
Right, and so that actually leads me into a few other questions that I wanted to ask. I think one thing that we've probably all heard is, blockchain can save the world, or, it can solve massive problems like, giving, refugees identities and bringing transparency to supply chains. And, we see these kind of utopian aspirations. And I think social scientists in particular are in really a good place to respond to these sorts of things. What do you guys make of those sorts of claims?
I will follow you because you study this. So
Oh, great.
This is
I
your...
should defer to you on this for sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
So for techno-utopianism, well, first of all, it's important to make a distinction which actors in the space are techno-utopian, because based on my research, I spoke to Ethereum developers and they were not techno-utopic at all. They were very level-headed, pragmatic, and I would say they were shy from stating anything that blockchain is going to save the world or sounding technologically optimistic. And I think part of that is because they see the challenges that are ahead of them. They have their own set of tasks and priorities, which are different from, I guess, someone involved on the business venture side of blockchain, where they might want to use techno-utopianism as a marketing tool. Like techno-utopianism certainly has a utilitarian purpose, which is to sell an idea or some sort of new product that has very little success stories behind it. So techno-utopianism in the space essentially acts like a story that gives people some sort of vision of what the technology might evolve to be, to help them make decisions of whether the technology or even the ICO or idea or whatever it is worthy of the investment and of the time. So yeah, there are distinctions between actors in the space.
Right. And so before returning to you, Jason, I just want to pause there to talk a little bit more about kind of ideology. And you mentioned that there is this sort of disjuncture between kind of the claims that people make to techno-utopianism, if I've understood correctly, and how they actually behave. And so could you say a little bit about kind of what you make of kind of the ideological spectrum of, the industry? I mean, I know your kind of speciality is Ethereum. And I mean, how would you say that kind of people's perceptions kind of align with actually what you saw going on the ground?
Something interesting, more related to ideology, is that there's a plurality of ideologies in Ethereum. So I found that there's a lot of left-wing people and right-wing people, in the space together. And I think that's actually a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, and that's not always, I think, how people perceive Ethereum, too.
Yeah,
you often
exactly.
sort of don't hear about the right-wing element of it, sort of associated more with Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. But it's certainly there.
It's there.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so to kind of return to the conversation about, ideas about kind of utopianism in the industry, Jason, what do you make of claims to these big aspirations and things like that?
I really like that you separated out the technologists from the business side of it, because I think you're absolutely right. The people on the business side are the ones making the claims much more than in a lot of systems, but then there are other systems that really began for ideological reasons. So it's very hard to say.
Yeah.
It really depends on the application, and it depends on who's marketing to whom and what the goal is, and so it's a very squishy answer. But a privacy coin that really deeply believes in privacy is going to make very ideological statements that will be different than someone trying to market their enterprise software solution, but they might come across as the same. To your point about different people believing different things. And so I always get a little uncomfortable when people talk about the ideology of blockchain and the whole space, because once you get outside of one community, there's not really, it doesn't hold together.
Right, and so that's kind of a question that I've been dealing with a little bit in my research, and I'd be interested to hear what you guys think as a researcher, because I find that, this is a distributed phenomenon, this, sort of all of this technology and this movement per se, but there are kind of a lot of different communities and subsets, and it's quite difficult to sort of figure out if there are any generalizable features of these people that, can you really even talk about the industry as a whole, or should we really be talking about the enterprise sector and Ethereum and Bitcoin and sort of all of these different aspects of it separately. You know, what do you guys make of that?
Well, I'm happy. Yeah. So I spend a lot of time thinking about this in terms of thinking about organization, and I've ended up trying to, in looking for ways to be as generalizable as possible, have ended up splitting things into communities of investors, hardware owners, for open source coders, users, ecosystem partners, and then you start getting into questions like, what is an ecosystem, right? Everybody defines that differently, but once you start creating your own definition for that, then it becomes more possible to think about how the space holds together. And then what do you think about, you know, so I'm working with topic modeling and trying to tease out categories on 3 dimensions. So one of them is sort of the domain of application, another one is where you are in the technology stack, and then another one is, I forget the third one, but maybe functionally. Is a payment project that's specifically for the adult industry different from a payments project that is for peer-to-peer payments? And why should we think about them differently, and how?
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts?
No, I think Jason put it very well, yeah.
Okay, and since we're kind of getting to the last 10 minutes here, I just have a couple more questions. I'm curious to I think it would be worth covering also kind of the dystopian aspects of blockchain, and you touched on those a little bit, and you sort of talked about the internet and how that's kind of created its own problems. And so kind of the question is, you know, what bad things could blockchain do for our society, or how could it negatively impact society and culture? Is it already doing that?
I'm skeptical, I have to say. Like, all the things it strikes me that the things that I find most discomforting about technology and the way that it's used some of them are being talked about in blockchain, but blockchain is totally not necessary for them. So for example, the social credit score in China. There are a lot of blockchain projects that look a lot like that, but don't phrase it that way. And so you could argue that blockchain coming could bring this kind of what I view as a dystopian thing. That's just me. But the fact of the matter is it's happening without blockchain. And so anything sort of dystopian that might happen with blockchain, I think we have to be careful about questioning whether it would happen anyway.
You know? Interesting.
Yeah, I think the possibilities for a dystopian blockchain future are endless. Like, it could easily be a Black Mirror episode. Again, just getting to the wrong hands. You know, it could be in the hands of the government, or just like the top 1% of the world, right? So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how blockchains are kind of replicating existing inequalities and also shifting the landscape of inequalities. And I mean, one thing that I worry about a lot is that you know, the blockchain is sort of supposed to be this transparent thing, and transparency is a thing that we've kind of aspired to as a society in the last 10 years probably, and that it's only transparent in certain ways, and that has the capacity to kind of obscure other, you know, sort of important things. And so when you're looking at, you know, when I see Walmart, you know, or De Beers talking about, you know, we can bring transparency to our supply chains and that sort of thing with blockchain, it kind of drives me crazy.
Right, transparency to who?
Right, and I mean, is the public actually ever going to even see these blockchains? I mean, that's the thing. Is it even transparent if nobody gets to see it?
But I think that gets to something I find really interesting, which is the question of how do you have a knowledge economy or a knowledge society when things are so complex that only a tiny group of people understand them?
Right.
I mean, how many people can actually legitimately code smart contracts?
Right.
Probably not that many compared to the number of people even at this conference. So what does transparency mean? You know, transparency, if I can go and read the code on GitHub, that might as well be in Cyrillic, right? Like that doesn't, so transparency in name is okay, but transparency for who and how? By the same token, it would be idiotic for me to expect to understand, right? Like, people are specialists, they have expertise, they should be using it.
Right, and I think one kind of important thing is to think about, like, okay, you know, we've tried to disintermediate a whole bunch of technocrats with this technology, and sort of, okay, well, who are the new technocrats? You
exactly.
know? Who are those people, and what are the consequences of that? I think that's a big question.
Yeah.
A big question. Any thoughts?
just on that, I think this is exactly where the role of social sciences steps in, because it could extend the dialogue, and it could provide a way to communicate to the general public these blockchain concepts and terms. I think it's very important to bridge the gap between these technocrats and the rest of the world, and I think as social scientists, that is our responsibility.
Absolutely. And so I'd be curious to know kind of how if your work has been discussed in the industry, if you've had a chance to talk to anybody in the industry about your work, how it's been received, and then also how things have gone in academia. I've found that, I mean, in my department, pretty much people look at me like I have 3 heads when I talk about the blockchain, and very few of them really know how to talk about it. And I found also that a lot of anthropologists are quite flippant about it. The ones who have looked at this sort of thing think, well, Bitcoin, it's interesting because it sort of makes these, allusions to metalism or whatever, and then leave it at that because it's a whole bunch of libertarian white dudes, and who cares about them anyway. Right. So I'd be curious to see what you guys kind of have encountered.
Yeah. That's
it's a lot.
It's rough. It is really difficult in a discipline that doesn't, that is the downside, right, of being a social scientist in a space that's not normally one where your social science goes. My chair of my committee, it took him a year to go from calling it Bitcoin to calling it BitChain to then getting to blockchain. So it just, you end up doing a lot of work that you wouldn't otherwise have to do. I would also, so as far as testing things and talking to people, I spend a lot of time at meetups, and I'm on a governance working group with a coalition for automated legal agreements, and so I do spend a lot of time talking to people saying, this is sort of what I'm seeing, and this is how I'm thinking about it, and then, yeah, because you don't want to go too far away from something that people recognize as part of their world. Yeah, I will also say, I don't know how far along you are in your programs, but I find funding to be a challenge as a social scientist, because the funding for this goes to computer scientists who are studying protocols. At Princeton, we don't have a business school, so there's no interdisciplinarity around organizations. And so Ripple gave a bunch of money to Princeton, and it went right into the computer science department, where they're studying protocols and how to make things safer. And so, which is great, that's what they should be doing. But that, there are certain networks of resources that can be challenging if you're from outside of computer science.
Yeah, precisely. And I think one problem that I've found in anthropology is because I'm not really studying usually anthropologists sort of go off to far off places and study people in kind of rural places and this sort of thing. And it unfortunately kind of has that element of the exotic still. But not doing that has posed a real issue. Studying people at home and studying people who social scientists often kind of don't think are worthy of study. Like I said, these libertarian white guys, they're kind of like, we don't want to give you money for that. Have you kind of found something similar?
So it's interesting because in the actual blockchain communities, I found that people are very welcoming of social scientists. I think they see the value in that perspective. On the academia side, there are really very little specialists in the social science. And even with supervisors, you have to find something that's very remotely related to your what you're interested in relation to blockchain. So, but it's also a fairly new field, and I think it's now gaining a lot of traction, and we're going to be seeing more social science research out there. And academia is always slow to catch up with what's happening in industry. But yeah, so.
And I think, so we have about 1 minute left here, so I just want to end by asking you guys, how can we make sure that our research doesn't just stay in academia, and that we could actually maybe kind of interact with the industry and help the industry kind of sort out some of its problems and make sense of what's happening?
I think you have to meet people where they are. So, for example, I'm trying to get my papers into online archives as soon as possible, so that people can see them and so that you can share them and share them on Twitter or social media or whatever, and so that you can open up your comments to people beyond academics. I think that's a big part of it. I think going to meetups and maybe, once I'm further along and I have some results, I'd like to present in those kinds of settings in addition to the academic settings, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to spread yourself out. Don't just be an academic writing papers and doing research. I think you have to go out, talk to people, talk to industry people. I mean, sometimes that is very uncomfortable, but you have to do it. I mean, you have to extend the dialogue because you're not going to see much change, you know, with just writing research papers. You have to be active, not just a passive observer.
Right, certainly. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but I hope we've entertained you sufficiently, and hopefully you'll take some interest in what we are doing. But thank you guys so much. That was a really interesting conversation.
That's great.